he suddenly heard someone shouting for help. And without hesitation he rushed over. He saw two men robbing a woman of her money. Nikolai did not say a word and immediately pulled out his pistol to stop them. The two men then used the woman's life as leverage, threatening Nikolai not to interfere. But a battle-hardened Nikolai would never be restrained by two petty thieves. He decisively fired a shot, injuring the right hand of the man holding the dagger. Seeing this, the two criminals turned and ran without another word. Although the criminals escaped, the woman was still unable to recover from the shock. Nikolai did everything he could to calm her down. After a long while, the woman slowly wiped the blood from her face and softly said that they had stolen her food ration coupons, which were her supplies for the coming month. Hearing her words, the helpless Nikolai could only take a deep breath and comfort her, saying that everything would be alright. The next evening, when the woman returned from the munitions factory and passed through the alley again, she saw Nikolai once more. It turned out that Nikolai had been waiting there specifically to bring her food. The woman did not take the food right away, because in this time of war, all food was rationed for everyone. She knew that the food in Nikolai's hands must have been saved bit by bit from his own rations. Seeing this, Nikolai hurriedly lied and said that pilots had plenty of food rations and that he could never finish them every day. But the woman still shook her head. She did not want a soldier fighting for his country to go into battle hungry because of her. Nikolai then said that her ration coupons had been stolen, and as a soldier, helping her was his responsibility. As he spoke, he stuffed the bag of food into the woman's hands. That was how they became friends. Nikolai had thought the woman was an ordinary worker at the munitions factory, but it turned out she was only volunteering there, and her real work was performing song and dance at the opera house. However, because the war had broken out, the opera house was temporarily closed, so the woman was actually unemployed at that moment. The two of them went back and forth like this, and soon fell deeply in love. But they had been together for less than 3 days when Nikolai received orders to return to the front line. Before departing, they agreed that when Nikolai returned next time, they would hold a wedding and become husband and wife, with expectations of a happy and beautiful future together. Nikolai climbed into his fighter plane and began a long and grueling combat journey. Their mission was to strike a German armored unit advancing rapidly along the road. The moment they spotted the German armored forces, they immediately dove toward them without hesitation. Seeing the sudden Soviet air attack, the alert German troops opened fire in response, but their bullets could not inflict any real damage on the Soviet aircraft. Left with no choice, the German forces scattered and fled. In the next second, they were hit by a deadly strike from the Soviet planes, just as Nikolai finished attacking the German forces and was joyfully preparing to return to base. 3 German fighter planes suddenly appeared behind them. After a fierce battle, they managed to shoot down 1 German aircraft, but being outnumbered, they ultimately could not escape the fate of being shot down. As fuel continued to leak, Nikolai knew there was no chance of returning to base. At that moment, the only thing they could do was to quickly find a suitable place and attempt an emergency landing as safely as possible. However, before they could find a landing spot, they unexpectedly encountered German anti-aircraft guns guarding a bridge. Seeing the aircraft flying straight toward them, the German troops immediately grew tense, turned the guns, and unleashed a fierce barrage. With no other choice, Nikolai had to change direction in an attempt to evade, but the German anti-aircraft fire refused to let up and was determined to shoot the plane down. Sure enough, in the next second, the aircraft was hit by a shell, lost control, and plunged straight toward the forest. The German troops guarding the bridge immediately assembled their forces and began pursuing the crash site. Before long, the aircraft piloted by Nikolai slammed heavily into the snow. The two had just crawled out of the wreckage when the pursuing German soldiers arrived nearby. They rushed non-stop toward the crash site. Seeing the suddenly appearing Germans, the alert Nikolai immediately crouched down to hide. His comrade used the aircraft's machine gun to fire fiercely at the Germans. Nikolai also quickly pulled out his pistol and opened fire. Under the suppression of machine gun fire, the German soldiers could barely move forward, so they brought out mortars to fight back. Before long, the machine gun ammunition was completely exhausted. They had no choice but to get up and flee into the forest. But in the next second, a shell suddenly exploded beside Nikolai. With no other option, his comrade hoisted him onto his back and continued to flee. But the Germans were never going to let them escape so easily. After running for an unknown length of time, the comrade, unfamiliar with the terrain, suddenly realized they were trapped. A wide river had blocked their path. At the critical moment, the comrade spotted a protruding sheet of ice. He exerted all his strength to place the unconscious Nikolai onto the ice, then used a wooden stick to strike hard and fast. breaking the ice free so Nikolai could drift downstream on it. He himself ran along the riverbank in the opposite direction to draw the Germans' attention away. After an unknown amount of time, the unconscious Nikolai slowly opened his eyes. He looked around but could not see his comrade anywhere. Just then, the sound of a motorcycle engine suddenly came from the riverbank. Nikolai followed the sound and saw two German soldiers slowly come into view. Panicked, Nikolai jumped into the water and desperately swam toward the opposite shore. The two German soldiers spotted Nikolai in the water from afar and immediately opened fire. Just as Nikolai climbed onto the bank, he was unfortunately hit by a bullet. Enduring the pain, he struggled to his feet and ran toward the forest. He ran a long distance before daring to stop and rest. He then quickly gathered branches and wood, tore a small piece from his map, and lit it with a lighter. He used the burning map to ignite the branches. He briefly treated his gunshot wound and dried his clothes by the fire, then continued his escape without delay. When hungry, he dug up wild plants to eat, and when thirsty, he ate the snow on the ground. He moved through the forest like this for 2 full days, until that night, when he suddenly sensed strange noises not far away. He immediately sprang up in panic and looked around, but all he saw was endless darkness, just as Nikolai thought it was an illusion caused by prolonged tension from constant. A starving wolf suddenly lunged out of the darkness toward him. He struggled desperately and fought with all his strength, finally managing to shove the wolf into the fire. The wolf that fell into the flames immediately scrambled up and fled. After driving the wolf away, Nikolai barely had time to catch his breath when he noticed several more wolves staring straight at him from the nearby forest. Terrified, he hurriedly pulled out his gun and decisively pulled the trigger at the wolves. Hearing the gunshots, the wolves quickly fled without hesitation. Nikolai sat there in a daze for the entire night, no longer daring to fall asleep. At dawn, he immediately set off once again on his long escape. After walking for an unknown length of time, he heard sounds behind him again. He suddenly turned his head and saw the same wolves from the night before appearing behind him. Seeing this, Nikolai broke into a run, pushing himself with all his remaining strength, but wounded by a gunshot. How could he possibly outrun agile wolves? Before long, the wolves blocked his path from the front. Panicked to the core, Nikolai quickly pulled out his pistol and aimed it at the wolf's head. The wolf only growled and stared at Nikolai. Without moving any closer, Nikolai seized the moment and tried to continue escaping forward, but then discovered that not far ahead stood a bridge guarded by many German soldiers. One German soldier who was about to relieve himself was slowly approaching Nikolai, with wolves in front and German soldiers behind. Whether Nikolai fired or not, escape seemed impossible. The wolves also began inching closer to Nikolai. Just as Nikolai sank into despair, he suddenly heard the thunderous roar of aircraft engines in the distance. 3 Soviet fighter planes were rapidly swooping toward the bridge guarded by the Germans. The German soldiers on the bridge immediately activated anti-aircraft guns and opened continuous fire at the Soviet planes. The deafening explosions instantly scared the wolves away. Moments later, the Soviet aircraft began a fierce bombing run on the bridge. The German soldier who had been about to relieve himself panicked and hurried to find cover. By chance, he hid directly in front of Nikolai. He stood there staring wide-eyed at Nikolai in shock. After freezing for a moment, he finally reacted and tried to call for help. But Nikolai would never give him that chance and decisively pulled the trigger. Fortunately, the other German soldiers were fully focused on dealing with the Soviet aircraft and did not notice the gunshot. Nikolai seized the opportunity and immediately got up to continue his escape. Before long, however, the Germans discovered the body of the soldier Nikolai had shot. A sharp-eyed German officer instantly recognized that the soldier had been killed at close range by a pistol. He deduced that the shooter was very likely the Soviet pilot they had failed to capture for days. He immediately ordered a tight search around the bridge to hunt down Nikolai. At this point, after days of fleeing, lack of food, and a gunshot wound, Nikolai's consciousness began to fade. In his dazed state, he once again saw his beloved girlfriend. The last time they parted, they had promised to hold their wedding the next time they met. Now it seemed he might break that promise. In order to return alive to her side, he forced himself to stand up once more and continued the long and grueling escape. After only a few steps, he collapsed heavily to the ground again, yet relying on sheer willpower, he struggled back to his feet. After a difficult search, he was fortunate enough to find a fish frozen in the ice by the river. He immediately removed his gloves, pulled out his dagger, and forcefully pried the fish from the ice. Without hesitation, he stuffed the raw fish into his mouth and devoured it in large bites. Just as he finished eating and prepared to continue on his way, he discovered that the wolves he had encountered earlier had appeared before him once again. Terrified, he crouched down and crawled forward. trying to hide himself, but the alert wolves were not about to let him go. As the wolves drew closer, he had no choice but to stand up, retreat while preparing to draw his gun. In the next second, however, he fell straight into a trap set by hunters. Luckily, the wooden spikes inside the trap only pierced his thick cotton clothing. The wolves stood above the pit, howling furiously at Nikolai below. Nikolai quickly pulled out his gun, chambered a round, and prepared for a final fight. After staying on guard for a long time, he realized the wolves were only circling the pit and had no intention of attacking. He then took out his dagger and scraped wood shavings from the spikes, lighting them with his lighter. He did this to keep himself warm and to try to scare the wolves away with fire, but in the end, he failed to ignite the wood and was nearly suffocated by the thick smoke. The wolves, seemingly starving, stayed by the pit for an entire night without leaving. By dawn, they were even fighting each other over the food that had not yet been claimed. Hearing the wolves tearing at each other over his flesh, Nikolai was overwhelmed by an indescribable sense of helplessness and sorrow. After an unknown amount of time, one wolf suddenly jumped directly into the pit. The sudden attack knocked the gun out of Nikolai's hands. He reached out desperately to grab the gun, but could not reach it. With no other choice, he grabbed the wooden spike he had failed to ignite earlier. He then used it to drive the spike straight through the wolf's body. Using the wolf's flesh as food, Nikolai survived in the trap for 3 more days. In the end, he was fortunately rescued by a hunter. Because this area was under German control, the hunter hid him beneath hay on a wagon. Soon after, they unexpectedly encountered 2 patrolling German soldiers. Fortunately, the hunter was accustomed to bowing and scraping before the Germans, so they did not search the wagon carefully. In this way, the hunter safely brought Nikolai back to his home. To avoid being seen, he did not immediately move Nikolai off the wagon. Instead, he waited until nightfall to quietly transfer Nikolai into the house. It turned out that 2 Soviet soldiers were already hiding in the hunter's cellar. One was the hunter's son-in-law, and the other was his comrade, a medical orderly. The medic immediately conducted a careful examination of Nikolai. He determined that Nikolai's gunshot wound was infected and that his feet were badly frostbitten. More importantly, Nikolai was suffering from severe pneumonia. In other words, Nikolai's chances of survival were extremely slim. Even so, they still did everything they could to clean his wounds and fight to save his life. Just as the medic was working desperately to treat Nikolai in the cellar, a German military truck suddenly stopped in front of the old man's house. The old man suppressed his inner panic and slowly walked toward the Germans. He then began smiling and bowing as usual. It turned out that besides hunting, the old man was also a blacksmith. The Germans were only there to ask him to repair something. After understanding the purpose of the German visit, the old man immediately let his hanging heart settle and smiled as he said there was no problem. Then the old man began working busily, but unexpectedly, the Germans suddenly said to the old man, "I heard your son-in-law is a Soviet soldier." The old man immediately argued back that he had already cut ties with his son-in-law. The old man even said that if he ever saw his son-in-law, he would report him to the Germans at once. Of course, the German officer would not easily believe the old man's words, but he still offered a token compliment, praising the old man's loyalty to the Germans. What the German officer never imagined was that at this very moment, the old man's son-in-law, a medic, and the Soviet pilot Nikolai, whom the officer had been hunting for days, were all hidden in a cellar beneath a pile of coal. And right at that moment, the still unconscious Nikolai suddenly woke up from pain. The medic immediately covered Nikolai's mouth with all his strength, not allowing him to make a sound, but they still accidentally made noise. Drawing the German officer's attention, the German officer immediately began pacing around the room warily, listening and searching. He walked all the way to the coal pile before slowly stopping, yet he could no longer hear anything at all. Cautious, he pulled out his pistol and demanded to know what that sound had been. The old man calmly explained that it was just a mouse. Nothing to make a fuss about. After hearing the old man, the German officer fell silent for a few seconds, then fired several shots straight into the coal pile. Fortunately, the bullets did not hit the people hiding beneath it, and they barely managed to slip through. But unexpectedly, less than 10 minutes after the Germans left, they suddenly returned. They then directly moved the coal pile away and discovered the hidden cellar. But fortunately, the cautious old man had already had his son-in-law, and the medic dragged the half-conscious and severely wounded Nikolai toward the forest. Although the Germans found no one, they still discovered blood-stained cloth strips and the bowls the men had used to eat in the cellar. The old man and his family of 3 were hanged alive for helping Nikolai. The German officer looked at the house set on fire by his soldiers, filled with fury. Because of his momentary negligence, Nikolai had slipped away right under his eyes. Burning with rage, He swore that he would catch Nikolai as soon as possible and make up for this unforgivable mistake. Meanwhile, the barely conscious Nikolai was being dragged eastward by the two men as they fled desperately. They staggered in panic for an entire night. The German officer also searched with his men for an entire night. By dawn, the German officer finally discovered their trail. He then ordered two of his men to move left and right, preparing a three-pronged attack to launch a surprise strike on Nikolai and the others. At this moment, the old man's son-in-law and the medic were already exhausted to the bone. After thinking for a long time, the two ultimately made the cruel choice to abandon the immobilized Nikolai. Nikolai lay there in the snow, gradually being covered by ice and drifting snow. Before long, he was spotted by the pursuing German officer. The German officer held his rifle carefully and approached slowly. The man on the ground did not move at all, as if he had already become a cold corpse. The German officer kept closing in, trying to confirm whether this was the Soviet pilot Nikolai he had been hunting for days. But when he bent down to look closely, Nikolai suddenly opened his eyes and decisively pulled the trigger. The German officer died in Nikolai's hands without even a chance to react. Not far away, the two Soviet soldiers who had wanted to abandon Nikolai and flee alone were already racked with guilt. Hesitating and wavering, the instant they heard the gunshot, they stood up without hesitation and rushed back to Nikolai's side. When the medic saw the German officer's corpse, he secretly swore that no matter what, he would carry Nikolai away. But the comrade said that the German officer could not have come alone to hunt them, and that there was nowhere left to run. The comrade tried to persuade the medic to surrender to the Germans together. Furious, the medic did not say a word and threw a hard punch at his comrade. The comrade, knocked to the ground, sprang up in anger, cursed, and walked away from them alone. With no other choice, the medic could only continue the escape alone with Nikolai, who had lost the ability to move. After walking for an unknown length of time, they heard intense gunfire and explosions not far away. This meant that a Soviet unit must be fighting the Germans nearby, so the medic dragged Nikolai without stopping, rushing toward the battlefield with everything he had. Before long, they reached the chaos of the fighting. The medic dragged Nikolai across the ground, inch by inch, toward the Soviet positions. A Soviet sentry spotted them. A cautious Soviet officer immediately dispatched several soldiers to run toward them. After confirming they were their own men, the soldiers immediately helped the medic drag Nikolai back into the position. But at the very moment the medic, who had dragged Nikolai all the way back, was about to jump into the trench, he was suddenly hit by a German sniper. Nikolai was sent to a field hospital and survived by sheer luck. But because his feet were severely frostbitten, the doctors had no choice but to amputate his legs to save his life. The wounded men beside him hurried to comfort him, saying that even without his feet, at least he was lucky to be alive. As long as we live, there is still hope for life. Heartbroken, Nikolai could only lie back down in despair, seeing that all the other wounded men had received letters from their families. The already devastated Nikolai felt even more desolate inside. Because he had grown up in an orphanage with no family and no one to rely on, his only attachment was his beloved girlfriend. They had once promised that they would hold their wedding the next time they met, but now that he had become like this, how could he bear to burden the woman he loved? So he would rather suffer day and night on the hospital bed than tell his girlfriend what had happened to him. Even so, he still wrote letters to her every day, but none of those letters were ever sent. And every day when his girlfriend returned home, the first thing she did was open the mailbox, hoping for a letter from Nikolai. But every time, she opened it full of joy, and then closed it again with helpless disappointment. One afternoon 2 months later, the hospital held a performance. A nurse placed a pair of prosthetic legs in front of Nikolai, wanting to take him to watch the show that was about to begin, because almost all the wounded soldiers had already left the ward to watch the performance. But Nikolai, still drowning in despair over losing his legs, only quietly shook his head. The nurse had no choice but to turn around and leave alone. Not long after, Nikolai suddenly heard the announcer call out his girlfriend's name. He immediately got up, thinking it was only a performer with the same name as his girlfriend. But the moment the singing began, what he heard was his girlfriend's long-missed voice.
You and I share this heartfelt conviction. I feel certain inside that it's true. You and I are...
At that moment, long-missed happiness and joy flooded every cell in Nikolai's body. But looking at his amputated legs, he fell into hesitation again. He did not want his disabled self to burden his girlfriend's future life. Yet hearing his girlfriend's graceful, winding song drifting in from outside, he still could not resist wanting to get up and secretly take one look at the woman he had missed day and night. So he decided to put on these prosthetics he had resisted for many days, but because it was his first time wearing them, inexperienced as he was, the moment he stood up, he fell heavily to the floor. In order to secretly see his girlfriend just once, Nikolai did not give up, and instead crawled with all his strength toward the window. After crawling for who knows how long, he finally reached the window. Using his last bit of strength, he managed to pull himself up by the windowsill and stand, but he suddenly lost his courage, and instead sat down on the chair by the window. He missed his chance to meet his girlfriend face to face. After that, Nikolai finally stopped resisting the prosthetics and began training desperately with the help of doctors and nurses to walk on his own. Because he did not want his girlfriend to see him crawling on the ground in such a humiliating state, he wanted to stand steadily in front of her like a normal person. Time passed second by second, drop by drop, through his relentless effort, but because he trained too urgently day and night, the newly healed wound split open again. The doctor immediately ordered the nurse to confiscate his prosthetics and made him lie in bed to recover. After the wound healed, Nikolai began the painful training again. By now, he could already move forward slowly on his own with a single cane, but this was not the final outcome he wanted. He still insisted on practicing every day, pushing his body to its limits. That afternoon, he unexpectedly saw 3 fighter planes thunder past overhead. The thought of piloting a fighter plane again and soaring through the sky suddenly flashed through his mind, because besides his girlfriend, flying was the greatest love of his life. After a long period of grueling training, Nikolai could now control his prosthetic legs with great skill. If you did not look closely, it was almost impossible to tell he was a man wearing prosthetic legs. That morning, Nikolai unexpectedly saw a figure from behind that looked like his girlfriend. Just as he hesitated about whether to keep walking toward her, the other person suddenly turned around. The moment he saw his girlfriend, Nikolai immediately stopped in his tracks. He stood there frozen for a long time, because her sudden appearance left him not knowing how to face her. But what must be faced will always have to be faced. In the end, he gathered his courage and slowly walked toward her. When his girlfriend saw Nikolai, she immediately demanded in anger, "Why have you not contacted me for so long?" Because for more than half a year, she had hoped every day for a letter from Nikolai, but what she received was disappointment again and again, and she no longer remembered how many times she had secretly cried over it. If she had not run into him here today, she would have thought Nikolai had died on the front line. Faced with her questioning, Nikolai suppressed the storm of emotion inside and only said flatly that he had been too busy and had forgotten to write. The moment he said that, his girlfriend angrily turned and walked away. But how could she understand Nikolai's unavoidable? Fortunately, as she walked, she suddenly overheard 2 doctors discussing Nikolai's prosthetic legs. She immediately stopped and listened closely, and at last understood everything from their conversation. So she decisively turned back and, without hesitation, ran toward Nikolai. The 2 lovers held each other tightly in an embrace. Neither of them spoke, yet that silent embrace had already explained their vow to face life and death together and never give up. I am a film enthusiast. Thank you for watching. See you next time.